When World War I broke out, one major power didn't initially get involved: Italy. For almost a year, the Italians sat on the sidelines and watched their neighbours to the north battle it out. When they did finally get involved in the war, it would have been easy to assume that it would be a game changer. After all, Italy had a population of almost 40 million, similar to France or Britain. It also had an incredibly strategic position, which allowed it to open up a new front against the surrounded Central Powers. It would be fighting against Austria-Hungary, which had one of the weakest militaries of any nation at the time. Maybe the large Italian military would be able to invade Austria-Hungary, cause it to collapse, and bring about a quick end to the war. In the end, Italy's entrance wasn't decisive at all. In fact, it would end up being one of the least effective participants in the war. Over and over again, it tried to invade Austria, but made little progress and lost hundreds of thousands of men. So, why was Italy so ineffective? Why couldn't they make use of their huge army in strategic position? In this video, I'm going to answer all those questions. But first, let's have an overview of how it happened. The story of Italy in World War I. Before that, I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Ground News. Throughout the First World War, the Italian public were only able to know what was going on by reading the newspapers. As you would imagine, the information that they were getting was very biased, designed to serve an agenda and make the population believe whatever the media organizations wanted them to believe. The problem of media bias is as much a problem now as it was back then. Modern media companies often just cater to one side of the political spectrum, which means that they don't tell you the whole truth. Ground News shows you how different media outlets cover the same story, allowing you to compare headlines and see the political bias of each source. You can see how many sources are covering a particular story and whether it's being pushed by one side more than the other. A good example is this story about the repatriation of dead soldiers from Russia to Ukraine. Left-leaning outlets use emotive terms to emphasize the human and economic toll on Ukraine. They have titles like "The Terrible Cost of Bringing Ukraine's Soldiers Home" or "Ukraine War, Unwanted Dead." In contrast, right-wing sources adopt a more neutral tone, highlighting Russia's efforts with titles like "Russia handed over 1,212 dead soldiers to Ukraine, while 27 of their own soldiers were handed over to the Russian side." Another great feature of Ground News is their blind spot tool. That highlights stories that are being covered heavily by one side of the political spectrum and barely touched by the other. A good example is this story about Israel being on the verge of attacking Iran. Of the 30 sources that cover the story, not a single one of them is left-wing. As you can see, Ground News makes it very easy to spot media bias and get a more complete picture of what's going on. If you want to try it, go to ground.news/Henry, click on the link in the pinned comment or scan the QR code on the screen. You'll get unlimited access to their Vantage plan at 40% off, and you'll be supporting my work too. Thanks again to Ground News. In June of 1914, Europe was at peace and war didn't seem to be on the horizon. In fact, the continent was at the height of its power. The past century had been relatively peaceful, allowing for levels of prosperity and technological progress never before seen in human history. There were tensions between the nations, but they had just about been kept in check. Then, on the 28th of June, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. That act of terrorism would end up triggering an astonishing escalation into what would become the biggest war the world had ever seen. Germany and Austria-Hungary would find themselves fighting the combined forces of Britain, France, and Russia. When the war broke out, Italy was, on paper, in an alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary. However, instead of fighting with them, it declared neutrality. That is because their treaty was a purely defensive alliance. Italy argued that it wasn't obliged to get involved because Austria was the aggressor. In truth, Italy's neutrality wasn't that surprising because relations with Austria-Hungary had actually been very tense for decades. The two countries had competing claims over territories inhabited by ethnic Italians, which were under Austro-Hungarian control. When the war started, both sides saw that Italy could be a valuable ally and tried to convince it to join their side. The British and French promised Italy big territorial gains if it joined them. Eventually, after lengthy negotiations, Italy signed the Treaty of London and agreed to fight against Germany and Austria-Hungary. They hoped that the war would be quick, glorious, and benefit them handsomely. Instead, it turned out to be an utter disaster. Italy's war effort focused almost entirely on its northeastern border with Austria-Hungary. Unlike Britain or France, who were fighting all over the world, over 90% of Italy's military resources were concentrated on a single front along its northern border. It was a stretch of just 650 kilometers from the Alps to the Adriatic Sea. The terrain was some of the most hostile in Europe, with steep cliffs, high mountains, and freezing valleys. As soon as the war started, it quickly turned into a stalemate. The Italians did have more troops than the Austrians, but were hampered by the difficult terrain and their own outdated tactics. The main front was along the Isonzo River, which would become synonymous with brutal and repetitive trench warfare. There, the Italians would launch a total of 12 offensives over the course of 2 years. The first offensive began in June of 1915, 1 month after Italy entered the war. The Italians had twice as many men as the Austrians, but it counted for nothing. The Austro-Hungarians had strong defensive positions in the mountains and were able to inflict heavy casualties. Any gains for the Italians were slow and costly. The Italians' equipment was terrible. Many men had the outdated Carcano rifle, which had poor range and power. They wore thin woolen uniforms that would have been better suited to a parade ground than a snow-covered trench. Many men froze to death. In that first offensive, the Italians lost about 15,000 men and gained almost nothing. Despite the failure of the offensive, the Italian Chief of Staff, Luigi Cadorna, didn't change plan. A month later, he ordered another offensive along the Isonzo River. This time, the Italians outnumbered the enemy 3-1, but again, it counted for little, and they were unable to break the Austrian lines. Even though his plan had failed twice, Cadorna refused to try something different. In fact, over the next 2 years, he would launch another 10 offensives all along the Isonzo River. Every attempt produced the same result. The Italians would lose tens of thousands of men and gain only a few kilometers in territory. On the 11th offensive, the Italians did actually come quite close to breaking the enemy lines. The Austro-Hungarians were exhausted and wouldn't have been able to withstand another attack. If the Italians had attacked again, it might have been a major breakthrough. Unfortunately for them, they were also exhausted and couldn't find the resources for another assault. Eventually, in 1917, there was a major breakthrough on the front, but it wasn't by the Italians, it was by the Austro-Hungarians. With German support, they launched a huge offensive at Caporetto and broke through the front lines. The Italian resistance quickly collapsed as troops abandoned their positions. Whole units disintegrated as their men fled. In the chaos, the Italians left behind 3,000 machine guns, 3,000 artillery pieces, and thousands of tons of ammunition. Over 300,000 soldiers were captured, and the front lines retreated dramatically. The Italian army fell back nearly 150 kilometers, stabilizing only at the Piave River. The disaster at Caporetto had a huge effect on the Italian military, both materially and psychologically. Many Italian soldiers felt betrayed by the high command, describing the retreat as chaotic and leaderless. In some cases, officers actually fled before their men. The orders were so confused that entire units ended up marching in the wrong direction. Over 20,000 Italian soldiers surrendered without firing a single shot. In fact, the Italian lines collapsed so totally that the Austrian commander described them as a broken net through which the army flowed like water. The Italian press briefly tried to censor the disaster to prevent national panic, but people quickly found out. It was a national humiliation on the grandest scale. In fact, the Prime Minister, Vittorio Orlando, warned Parliament that the country faced not just a military defeat, but the collapse of the nation's spirit. Even today, the word Caporetto is used in Italy to mean a total failure. That disaster finally forced a change in leadership. The incompetent Cadorna was sacked and replaced with General Armando Diaz. Diaz halted the endless suicidal offensives along the Isonzo River and focused on rebuilding the army. He undertook significant reforms to boost morale, including better treatment of troops and improved logistics. With support from British and French reinforcements, the Italians were able to hold the new front line along the Piave River. After a few months, the Italian army had managed to regroup and regain its strength. Eventually, in October of 1918, with Austria-Hungary collapsing, Italy went on the offensive again. This time, at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto, it won its first major victory. The Italians were able to capture almost 500,000 Austrian soldiers, which caused the Austro-Hungarian Empire to collapse. On November the 3rd, Austria surrendered and signed a ceasefire with Italy. The war was over, and Italy was technically on the winning side. In truth, it hardly felt like a victory. Italy had spent 4 years fighting over the same patch of frozen mountain, and it had cost them about 500,000 men. At Caporetto, they had suffered one of the most humiliating defeats of any nation in the war. To really rub salt into the wound, Italy didn't get anything like what it had been promised by Britain and France. They had promised Italy a long stretch of the Adriatic coast, but then, after the war was over, they reneged. Italy came out of the war bitter, impoverished, and politically divided. Within just a few years, that chaos would help bring Mussolini and the fascists to power. So, that is what happened. Despite having one of the biggest armies in Europe and only one front to focus on, Italy performed disastrously. So why were the Italians so ineffective? What explains all the failed offensives and the absolute disaster at the Battle of Caporetto? Well, one of the biggest reasons was that the Italian leadership was atrocious. I'm actually talking about one man in particular, General Luigi Cadorna. Cadorna had been chief of staff since 1914, and he was in charge for most of the war. He was obsessed with discipline and old-school military thinking. He believed that bravery and obedience were more important than tactics or technology. What mattered most in a soldier was his willingness to charge. From the very start of the war, Cadorna had little respect for his men. He actually said that their individualism had made them morally unprepared for war. Cadorna's go-to tactic was the crude frontal assault. Again and again, he ordered his troops to charge at well-fortified Austrian positions in the mountains. That was sometimes with hardly any artillery support. When those offensives repeatedly failed, Cadorna refused to change plan. He would just launch another offensive again, with exactly the same tactics in exactly the same place. Those offensives often resulted in the loss of far more Italian troops than Austrians. For example, in the third offensive in October of 1915, over 70,000 Italian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The Austrians lost only about 40,000. In truth, it was always pretty obvious that the crude frontal assaults were going to fail. One reason was the terrain. The ground was made of solid limestone, so digging proper trenches was very difficult. Another reason is that the Austrians had the high ground. They were in concrete bunkers with clear lines of fire onto the advancing Italians. Something that might have made the offensives more successful is if they were better supported with artillery fire. Cadorna would regularly order attacks with only minimal shelling or none at all. For example, at the 9th Battle of the Isonzo, there was only about 24 hours of artillery fire before the troops were sent to attack. That did little to soften up the Austrian defences. It was far less artillery than other nations were using at the time. For example, before the British launched their famous offensive at the Somme, they fired over 1.5 million shells over the course of a week. When those offensives failed again and again, it should have been obvious that something needed to change. Any half-decent commander would have seen the poor results and tried a different approach. Other commanders from other nations were doing just that, trying to experiment with new tactics to try to break the deadlock of trench warfare. At the Battle of the Somme, the British tried a brand new technology, the tank. Tanks showed real promise as they could smash through barbed wire and provide cover for artillery. Italian engineers did start working on their own versions. However, Cadorna wasn't interested. He dismissed tanks as unreliable and overpriced. It's important to note that not everyone in the Italian military was so hostile to new technologies. For example, one colonel, Giulio Douhet, argued that air power could change the face of war. Douhet was a forward-thinking man that was well ahead of his time. He wanted the creation of an independent air force years before anyone else in Europe was taking that idea seriously. Again, Cadorna wasn't interested. He saw Douhet's ideas as questioning his leadership. After a series of arguments, he shut Douhet down and demoted him. The reason that Cadorna was so against adopting new technologies was because his whole idea of war was stuck in the previous century. For him, victory was about the soldier's willingness to sacrifice himself and keep advancing. We can see that in the guidance that he gave to attacking troops. Cadorna wrote, "Infantry that finds itself under fire during an attack must remove itself from the fire as quickly as possible in the only way permitted, by proceeding with all speed. Stopping and lying down would be a very serious mistake." The fact that Cadorna was so old school and stubborn was far from the only reason that he was such a bad commander. Another reason is that he was miles away from the front line. He ran the war from his headquarters in Udine, about 20 miles away, and barely visited the battlefield at all. That meant that communication was very slow, and so he was making decisions based on outdated information. His orders then had to be passed down through various layers of bureaucracy. Sometimes it took hours or even a day for his instructions to reach the front line. That might have been less of a problem if the lower-level commanders had had more autonomy to adapt to the situation on the battlefield. However, Cadorna was such a control freak that he insisted that the junior officers follow his instructions to the letter, no matter how much the situation on the ground changed. As you would imagine, forcing the men to repeatedly carry out all those suicidal offensives had a terrible effect on morale. One lieutenant wrote about how depressing they all found it. He wrote, "It's not the dying that's the demoralizing thing. The thing that grinds you down is dying so uselessly, for nothing. That is not dying for the fatherland. It is dying for the stupidity of specific orders and the cowardice of specific commanding officers." Gradually, the troops came to resent Cadorna. In fact, they even came up with a mocking rhyme for him. It went, "See Cadorna rampage, hear him roar. He's killed all the mice on the kitchen floor." They were essentially saying that Cadorna was to blame for the huge losses that they were taking. Another reason that the men resented Cadorna was his fanatical obsession with discipline. In fact, because of him, Italy had the harshest system of military justice of any army in the war. He personally signed off on the execution of more than 750 of his own men. On one occasion, 29 men were executed in a single day just for some minor disobedience. In total, throughout the course of the war, a whopping 1 in every 17 Italian soldiers would face a disciplinary charge. 61% of those men were found guilty. Often, the men were punished for the most trivial of crimes. One soldier wrote about how men were tied up and left outside in the freezing cold for breaking minor rules. In his words, ordinary soldiers were treated worse than beasts. Ironically, when it was found out that that soldier had written that, he was given 6 months in prison. That draconian discipline was all because of Cadorna. The result of it was that the army became afraid of its own leadership. In fact, one officer wrote about a time when he encountered a unit that had just been decimated. In his words, "The soldiers trembled at the mere sight of me." Another huge problem with Cadorna's leadership was that he didn't want to cooperate with anyone. He flatly refused to cooperate with Britain and France, even though it was clearly the sensible thing to do. He wouldn't even share intelligence with them. That was mainly because he didn't trust them. Cadorna believed that Britain and France would never treat Italy as an equal. He was convinced that if he did cooperate with them, it would mean him having less power. He saw all foreign advisors as rivals who were trying to undermine his authority. However, it wasn't only Britain and France that found it impossible to work with Cadorna. He also refused to work with his own government. He ran the war almost as a dictatorship and totally ignored the advice of ministers. For Cadorna, the politicians weren't partners, but amateurs who had no business telling him how to fight his war. In fact, he didn't want anyone to have any input at all. At one point, the Prime Minister suggested creating a council of war, which would have on it generals and politicians. Cadorna bluntly refused, declaring, "I am answerable only to the king." In the end, Cadorna's failings did catch up with him and eventually cost him his job. It all came out of the catastrophic defeat at Caporetto in 1917, one of the worst disasters of any nation in the entire war. The Austro-Hungarians, backed by German units, launched a surprise attack and caught the Italians totally off guard. Cadorna had been warned repeatedly that an attack was likely, but he ignored the warnings, saying that they were exaggerations. Because of that, no reserves were moved into position, and so the frontline troops were spread very thin. When the Germans did attack, they were able to break the Italian line and drive them into a chaotic retreat. Even though the catastrophe was in large part Cadorna's fault, he refused to take any responsibility. In his official report after the battle, he blamed the troops, accusing them of cowardice, defeatism, and sabotage. He didn't say anything about his own role in the disaster. However, by that point, Cadorna had alienated almost everyone, and so Caporetto did turn out to be the end of him. Eventually, Britain and France insisted that he be dismissed if they were going to help Italy recover from the defeat. The Italian government agreed, and Cadorna was replaced by General Armando Diaz. We can actually see how bad Cadorna was for the Italian military by how much better it got after he was removed. Where Cadorna had ruled with fear, Diaz led with trust and pragmatism. His first move was to stop the pointless offensives. The army was exhausted and morale was at an all-time low. Rather than throwing his men back into the mountains, Diaz focused on defense and gave the army time to recover. He also made important reforms, like getting rid of the harsh punishments and gave frontline commanders more autonomy to make decisions. In June of 1918, the Austrians launched another offensive, but this time the Italian forces held firm and were able to repel them. Then, in October, the Italians themselves went on the offensive. This time, under Diaz's leadership, they were incredibly successful and won a crushing victory. Almost 500,000 Austrian troops were captured. Diaz had finally delivered the victory that Cadorna had spent years chasing. As you can see, the terrible leadership of Cadorna was one of Italy's biggest problems in the war, but that was far from the only issue. Another major problem was that the Italian military didn't have the equipment that it needed, neither the quality nor the quantity. Let's start with the equipment itself. Even by the standards of the time, much of what the Italian troops were given was poor. Their main rifle was the Carcano M1891. The Carcano was significantly less powerful than the rifles used by other powers at the time. It fired bullets at about 600 meters per second. That is only about 2/3 of the speed of the main German rifle, which shot bullets at about 900 meters per second. It also shot bullets that were significantly lighter, and so had a shorter range and was able to do less damage. Italian machine guns weren't much better. Their main model was the Fiat Revelli M1914, which had a very flawed feed mechanism for the bullets. The rounds had to be oiled before firing, otherwise the gun would jam. It was also famous for overheating. Overall, it was far less reliable than the British or German machine guns. Finally, the Italian artillery was also very outdated. Their main gun was the 75-27 Modello 6, which was almost 10 years out of date when the Italians entered the war and was very much showing its age. It had a range of about 7 kilometers, which was far less than other artillery of the time, which could get up to 10 kilometers. Also, it could fire only about 6 rounds per minute, roughly a third of what other guns could do. However, not only were the Italian weapons weaker than those of other nations, they were also in very short supply. The situation was bad when Italy entered the war in 1915. They had only about half the number of machine gun units and a quarter of the artillery that they were supposed to. Italy had far less equipment than the other participants in the war. It had just 2,000 field guns, about half as many as France and a third as many as Germany. It also lacked machine guns, having about 600, which was absolutely nothing compared to Germany, which had over 4,000. As the war went on, Italy did produce more equipment, but never managed to close the gap totally. At the end of the war, it still had only about a third as many machine guns as Germany. Something else that was in desperately short supply was ammunition. I mentioned earlier that one of the reasons that the Italian offensives were so unsuccessful was because there wasn't enough artillery support. In the words of one lieutenant, "We are ordered to advance against machine guns, but without the artillery to silence them, we go forward into a wall of fire." The reason that there wasn't enough artillery support is that Italy simply wasn't able to produce enough shells. Throughout the war, it produced about 80 million shells, which was barely a third of what Germany produced. Cadorna was aware of the acute shortage of ammunition. His proposal was to create a ministry in the government whose job it was to increase production as much as possible. That did happen, but unfortunately the production numbers never got as high as the other nations. That is because the Italian economy simply couldn't produce enough, as it was nowhere near as industrialized as the likes of Britain or Germany. We can see that when we look at the amount of raw materials that each nation was producing. Coal is a good example. In 1914, it produced only about 1 million tons of coal, while Britain and Germany both produced about 300 million. That meant that Italy had to import most of its coal, which was a huge problem for a country trying to fight a long industrial war. It was a similar story when it came to steel production. Before the war, Germany was producing about 19 million tons of steel, while Britain was producing about 10 million tons. Italy, on the other hand, was producing under 1 million tons. Overall, the Italians were simply less wealthy than some of the other participants in the war. In 1913, GDP per capita was half of what it was in Britain and about 2/3 of what it was in Germany. I would say that those are the main reasons for Italy's poor performance in the war, but there is one last thing worth mentioning. That is that Italy as a nation was incredibly divided. It wasn't united behind the fight. For a start, the decision to enter the war in the first place was very controversial. The majority of the Italian parliament were against getting involved in the war, as was most of the public. I mentioned earlier the Treaty of London, in which Italy negotiated with Britain and France and agreed to enter the war. Well, that agreement was actually made in secret, behind the back of the Italian parliament. When the news did finally get leaked to the public, it was incredibly controversial. Up and down the country, there were big protests against the decision. For example, in Turin, 100,000 anti-war protesters demonstrated and put up barricades. They fought with police while shouting, "Down with the war." In the end, over 100 people were arrested and one was killed. There were also attempts to sabotage the government's conscription efforts. Local women cut telegraph wires and attacked the vehicles of the conscription teams. Even when the men were actually marching off to the front, the population still didn't get any more enthusiastic. One officer described marching through a village with his unit singing Fratelli d'Italia, a patriotic song which means Brothers of Italy. Instead of cheering the troops as they marched off to fight, the villagers just stood there and watched. In the words of the officer, the mass of the population stayed silent. Even later, when Italy was actively fighting in the war, much of the country was still not united behind the fight. For example, the attitude of the Italian socialists towards the war effort was summed up with their slogan, "Neither support nor sabotage." However, some of them did actually try to sabotage the war effort. They distributed anti-war propaganda or even organized desertions of the troops. The Catholic Church was also not particularly behind the fight. In fact, in 1917, Pope Benedict XV called for an end to what he called a useless slaughter. As you would imagine, that wasn't good for morale. The lack of unity meant that the governments that were overseeing the war were very unstable. Initially, the Prime Minister was Antonio Salandra, but he was forced to resign in 1916 because of all the military failures. His successor, Paolo Boselli, fared no better. He was forced to resign after little more than a year because of the disaster at the Battle of Caporetto. I think the fact that a single defeat could topple the government really shows how fragile Italy was politically. Unlike other countries, Italy never formed an all-party unity government. The socialists stayed in opposition and the liberals refused to get involved. The reason that Italy was so divided about the war is simply that the country itself was very divided. In fact, different parts of the country were basically totally different countries. It's important to remember that Italy had only unified about 54 years before it entered the war. Before then, the Italian peninsula had been made up of multiple small states. That meant that many people felt a stronger connection to their own town or region than to the government in Rome. In fact, large parts of the country didn't even speak Italian. In the south particularly, people spoke in local dialects or in entirely different languages like Sicilian or Neapolitan. The effects of all that were very visible during the war. In particular, there was a very strong north-south divide. At the time, the South was much less developed than the North, with incomes only half as high and much lower rates of literacy. As a result, men from the South were often treated with contempt. They were, to some degree, used as cannon fodder, sent straight to the frontline positions, which were the most deadly. Industrial workers from the North, on the other hand, were actually exempt from conscription. That meant that men from the South were overrepresented amongst the Italian troops, and that was a problem for many reasons. First, those men were less well educated. About a third of them were illiterate, far more than the likes of Germany, which had a rate of illiteracy of about 1%. That was an issue as war was becoming ever more sophisticated and the soldiers were required to do ever more complicated things. Second, those men were less committed to the concept of the Italian nation, and so they were always going to be less willing to fight for it. That is because when Italy unified in 1961, the South didn't particularly want it to happen. It was very much imposed on them by the North. That was an especially big problem because the very thing that Italy was fighting for in the war was to take some northern territories from Austria. Essentially, poor peasant farmers from the south were sent all the way to the north, where they were told to fight for Trentino or Trieste or some other place that they hadn't heard of. As you can imagine, they weren't particularly motivated. One consequence of that is that men from the south resisted conscription much more than men from the north. Draft dodging was a big problem for Italy during the war, and roughly 500,000 men resisted call-up. Another consequence was a very high rate of desertion. Over the course of the war, about 400,000 Italian men deserted the battlefield, which is about 10 times as many as for Britain. The lack of enthusiasm for the war wasn't just seen on the battlefield, but also within the population itself. As the war dragged on, the population was more and more affected. Food shortages became widespread, and there were even bread riots. By 1917, the price of basic goods like flour or olive oil had tripled. Inflation hit factory workers especially hard. By the end of the war, their wages were worth 25% less than they had been at the start. That led people to become ever more weary of the war and resentful. That was actually very good for the socialists, who had been against the war from the start. In the 1917 local elections, the party won majorities in big cities like Milan and Florence, which shows how angry the workers had become. Party membership also shot up. The socialist newspaper Avanti doubled its readers. It published slogans like "Down with the War," which became popular amongst protesters. In March of 1917, in Russia, there was a revolution and the Tsar was overthrown. Some thought that the same thing might happen in Italy. In August, there was a huge bread riot in Turin that turned into a full-scale anti-war uprising. The protesters demanded bread and peace, exactly the same slogan that had been used by the revolutionaries in Russia. The uprising was only suppressed when the government sent the army in. It took 4 days to crush the unrest, and by the end, about 50 protesters and 10 soldiers were dead. Overall, from the very start of the war, Italy was very divided, and neither the population nor the troops believed in the war effort. To be honest, a lot of them barely even believed in the concept of Italy itself. I think the situation is summed up well by an anecdote about the Italian military committing an atrocity against its own population. The story is from a military report from 1916 and tells of a tragic event where Italian troops shot dead some Italian villagers. The village had been taken by the Austrians, but had been won back by the Italians. When the Italian troops arrived to liberate it, the villagers were wary of them and met them with pitchforks. The Italian troops opened fire on the civilians and sacked the village. 150 Italian villagers were left dead. Following the massacre, the situation was summed up by a local girl like this: "Should we want peace or not? Believe me, we don't know which side we're on."